In this video, we're going to be talking about linear word problems, the different types of problems you might see, how to set them up, and things like that. So let's get started. I'm not going to go over every single problem because this video would become really lengthy and we don't want that. So we're just going to do like 2 from each section. So starting with number 1, some of these, or at least this section, you're given the slope and you're going to be given the y-intercept. So you have to know what those things are, be able to identify them, and then write your equation. So let me read it first. You and your friends plan to attend the county fair this weekend. The admission to the fair is $5 and the cost per ride is 50 cents. If your parents gave you $20, write and solve a linear equation to find how many rides you can go on. So my first thought is 1, find important information that you think is important. So anything with numbers is important. $5 is talking about admission. The cost per ride is 50 cents. Parents gave us $20. We have to write and solve to find how many rides we can go on. Okay, so those are important things. Now, our end goal is to write an equation, and then we have to solve it. But first, let's just write the equation. So we need pieces of this equation. We need to know what is y, what is m, what is x, what is b. So you can do one of 2 things. Either list this out on the side or in the problem itself, write it out, but be specific, label it. I'll show you what that means here in a second. Our y is usually our total. So our total in this problem would be the 20. Parents gave us 20, we can't spend more than what we don't have. So if you were writing it in the problem, you would do something like that. And we can say off to the side that y equals 20. Our m, slope, is usually something that's next to the word per. So if you see the word per, and no, I'm not a cat, that's usually your m. So the cost per ride would be your m. So I'm gonna just write that as cost / ride, so cost per ride, and we know that's 50 cents. Here, because it tells us cost per ride, we can say we don't have to specify that part. If you want to like highlight it or put brackets around it or something to show all of that is m, you could do that. For x, usually that's connected to your m. Look at the second part of the per statement. And in this case, it's ride. Rides, or number of rides, would be our x. And then we also can look in the problem and see, do we have a number of rides, or is that what we're asked to find? So when I look at the question, how many rides can we go on? That also helps us determine that this is number of rides and not cost of rides. We're looking at what don't we know. And because that's something we don't know, that's going to stay a variable x when we put it into the equation. And then the last thing that we do know is our b. Your b, in terms of real world linear word problems, is usually going to be like a one-time thing, a deposit, a fee, a charge no matter what, the admission, something like that, a one-time thing. So the admission to the fair, that would be your b, or the price of admission, however you want to write that. But we know that is $5. So then we can start to put together all of our pieces and parts. We know it has to be in the format y equals mx plus b. So let's take what we know. Y is 20. Our M is 0.5. Our X, we don't know, so that's going to stay a variable. Let me actually change it so we can color code. And then our B is 5. Now we have an equation. So that was part 1 of the question, write and solve. So we wrote the equation. Now we just have to solve it for X. So this would give us 15 equals 0.5x. Divide both sides by 0.5 and calculate it. And x would equal 30. Now, when we answer this, because these are word problems, we have to be specific about 30 what? What 30 what? What are we answering? The question asks how many rides, so our answer should be something like 30 rides. You can be more specific and write out an entire sentence, but as long as you are labeling what you're solving for, you're good. Right? Let's do another one like that. Number 2. While your family is visiting Deep Creek Lake, I don't know if this is a real lake or not, you and your mother decide to go boating. The rangers charge $6.50 per hour in addition to a $25 deposit to rent a canoe. If you wish to rent the canoe from 12:30 to 3:30 p.m., write and solve a linear equation to find the total cost to rent the canoe. All right, again, important information. We have a $25 deposit. The rangers charge $6.50 per hour. We're renting from this time. We're looking for the total costs. So let's start to put things together. We know Y is usually the total. In this case, when I look through everything, I'm asked to find the total. So that's going to stay a variable. I don't know what that is. My M, oops, I'm looking for that word per. So this would be the cost per hour or the charge per hour. Our, I'm sorry, and we know what that is, $6.50 per hour. Our X, the second part of the M, the per hour, is going to be number of hours. And here they tell us the time frame you rented the boat, or I'm sorry, rented the canoe from. So we just have to calculate how many hours has it been from 12:30 to 3:30. So that should be 3. It's supposed to be equals. And then our last part, our B, that's going to be our deposit. It also said in addition to, so we know we're adding. And we know that what that deposit is, $25. Then we can start to put our equation together. So we don't know what Y is. We do know that our M is 6.5, our X is 3, and our B is 25. And we know we're adding 25 because it says in addition to. The first one we did, the reason we added 5 is because you have to pay for admission as well as the price of each ride. So that would be an and situation. Then we could start multiplying. Come on. So y equals 19.5 plus 25, add that all up, and we get y equals 44.5. Again, we need some sort of labeling since y is the total cost, your labeling here would just be in dollars. $44.50 would be our final answer for that one. Right, so that's if you're given the slope and the y-intercept. Now we're going to change gears and go on to something else. In these next ones, we're going to be given two different objects, and we're going to write this in standard form. So with this number 5, let me read it first. Sam ordered 2 tacos and 3 enchiladas for lunch at the restaurant. His bill came to $7.80. If the enchiladas were $2, write and solve a linear equation to find the cost of each taco. So important things, we have 2 tacos, 3 enchiladas. We know his bill total. We know the enchiladas were $2, and we need to find the cost of each taco. With problems like this, there's going to be more things because we need to know what is A, what is X, what is B, what is Y, what is C. It's not just your standard y equals mx plus b format. So for this, the easier thing would be to start at what don't you know? Start at your question. Find the cost of each taco. Let's call that X. Usually whatever you're looking for is going to be your X or your Y. You're not usually going to be solving for your A or for your B. It just depends. Let me double check that I didn't say that. Yeah. So then that means if X is the cost of the taco, A has to be related to tacos. So A, we see that there's 2 tacos. So A would represent the number of tacos. And we know that's 2. Then anything about enchiladas has to be B and Y. So if A is the number of tacos, then B has to be the number of enchiladas. Those usually go hand in hand. I almost did not spell that right. We know that number to be 3. Then if X is the cost of each taco, Y has to be the cost of each enchilada. And we know the cost of each was 2. Then our final variable, our C, should represent the total cost of everything, which we know his bill came up to $7.80. Then it's just a matter of putting everything together in the standard form, ax plus by equals c. So A we know is 2. We don't know our x, so that's going to stay a variable. Then we are adding, because total usually is adding. B is 3. Our y value is 2. And we know it equals $7.80. So now we have an equation. Now we can start to solve. We're solving for x, so we can go ahead and multiply 3 and 2. Start solving for x by getting rid of 6, subtracting it on both sides, dividing both sides by 2. So 0.9 is our answer to x. Since we're looking for costs, we can either say dollars or we can say 90 cents. Cost 90 cents for each taco. Right, we're going to do one more of those types of problems. Number 7 is now we have a piggy bank. Jessie's piggy bank has all dimes and quarters. The total value of money in her piggy bank is $11.40. Jessie has 36 quarters. Write and solve a linear equation to find the number of dimes she has. Oh, really fast, going back. I don't think I wrote that this was C. Okay. So with problems like this, you're still doing the same setup. First, let's find important things. We know the total is 1140. She has 36 quarters. What's also important here is that she's working with dimes and quarters, because if it was like pennies and dimes or dimes and nickels, nickels and quarters, quarters and half dollars, whatever she's using is important. And we know we need to find the number of dimes. So again, let's start with the question and then work through that. Number of dimes, you can call that X, you can call it Y, it doesn't matter, as long as it's one of the variables. So we are not given the number of dimes, we're trying to look for that. So that's going to be our X. Now, these are written in the format ax plus by equals C, but we only have so many numbers. With problems like this, the A and the B here, you kind of have to know, because A is going to be the worth of a dime or the price of a dime. So the price of a dime, or like the dime's worth, is 10 cents. Then our Y has to be the opposite, the number of quarters. And we know the number of quarters to be 36. And then just like our A, we had to know our B would be the price of a quarter. Which would be 25 cents. And then our C would be the total value she has. I'm gonna write that up here because I'm running out of space. So if you were writing it within the problem, you would have your C, your Y, and your X, but you would still have to tell me what A and B are. Right? Then we can start putting pieces together. We have A, the price of a dime, 0.10, or 0.10, or 0.1, whatever you want to write. We don't know how many dimes we have. We know we are adding that because we have a total to the price of a quarter, 0.25, or 25 cents, and the number of quarters, which is 36, to equal our total value, 1140. And then we can start to solve. So we are solving for X. Multiply your 0.25 and 36 to get 9. Start solving for X by getting rid of 9. And then divide both sides by 0.10. It should give you a whole number, because if we're looking for number of dimes, we shouldn't get decimals. We can't have 0.5 of a dime. But we do have to be specific. We're looking for number of dimes, so 24 dimes would be our final answer there. Right. Moving on to the next section, we're going to do number 13. I'm sorry. I think I skipped one. Oh, that was 7. Oh, we're doing 10. My bad. All right, so in this section, let me scroll back up real fast. we're given a point, so a point xy, and a slope, our m, and we have to find our b to either find the b and that be our answer, or find the b to answer our question. So it depends. So with number 10, a construction company charges $15 per hour. I'm going to label as I go through. So $15 per hour for debris moved, plus a one-time fee for the use of the trash dumpster. The total fee for 9 hours of service was $195. Write and solve a linear equation to find the one-time fee for the trash dumpster. Okay, so I went through and I underlined important things: $15 per hour plus a one-time fee, total fee for 9 hours, $195, one-time fee. And then we can start listing things. Back when we were doing Unit 2A and writing equations, we talked about point slope formula. That's going to make its comeback. But first, let's talk about what we have going on here. When I put in the y value here, I'm going to count that as y1, our ordered part of our order pair, part of our point. Our y1 is going to be part of the total. And here, the total we have is 195. Our m would be our charge per hour. And that would be the 15. Our x1 would be what goes with the total, or if we're thinking x in general, the second part of our slope, the hour. So x1 is going to be the specific number of hours. So in this case, it's going to be 9. And then our b, remember I said b could be like a one-time fee. Here it says plus a one-time fee. That would be our b. It's also the thing we don't know. So notice how there's a b there twice, because they want to emphasize they are adding something. We just don't know what that thing is. If you wanted to write this as a ordered pair, 9, 195, and that m was 15, you could do that just to know how we came up with those numbers that we're about to use. And then we're going to go back and use our point slope formula. So let me write that first. Y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. Y would stay just the variable. Our y1 is 195. Our slope is 15. And then x minus our x1 is 9. And then we would go from there and start to distribute and solve. So y minus 195 equals 15x minus 135. Add 195 to both sides. So y equals 15x plus 60. In a normal equation, we have y equals mx plus b. Oops, I didn't mean to write this. I meant to write one-time b. So if the question is asking, what is that one-time fee? We're looking at what is our b value, and 60 would be our answer there. Or you can say one-time fee of 60. One-time fee? I don't know what I was writing there. So with these questions, you'll almost have everything, but still be missing something, and you have to do a point. Right? Now we're going to do 11. So 11 is similar, but now we're using a cable company. Company offers premium cable for $39.95 per month. As you start to read these, you could probably start to pick out things, plus a one-time setup fee. The total cost for setup and 6 months of service was $264. Write and solve a linear equation to find the total cost for 2 years of service. All right, so let's start to label things. Our Y1 is the total cost for those months. Our M, we know, is the cost per month. And we know that's the $39.95. Oh, I guess I can write this in too. Our X1 is related to the $264.70, so the 6 months. Our X in general is the number of months. And then our B, in this case, we don't know what that is again, because it says one-time setup fee. But the question is asking to find the total cost for 2 years. So what we're going to end up doing is finding the B so we can go back and find the total cost. So let's work on that first. We know the total cost for what we have was 264. So we're going to start writing it in our point slope. Y minus 264.70 equals our slope of 39.95 times our X minus our X1, which was 6. And then start to solve. Y minus 264.70 equals 39.95x minus 239.70. Get rid of the 264.70. So we have y equals 39.95x plus 25. Now we know what our b is. And this equation is going to help us actually answer the second part. So just because we found b, that's not what it was asking for. It was asking us to find the total cost for 2 years. So we have to go back. So now our total cost, remember that was our y. So that's going to be something we don't know now. We know our slope, the 39.95. Our number of months is our X, but here it has years. So you have to think about how many months would that be? 12 months in a year times 2, that would be 24. And now we know our B is 25. So we would start solving that. Multiply to get $958.80. And if we add 25, we get $983.80. So the total cost for 2 years of service would be $983.80. All right, we're almost done. Now, we're going to be given 2 points. So we're going to be given X values and Y values. Be thinking this is similar to if we're just given 2 ordered pairs and have to find the slope and then find the y-intercept. So for number 13, To surf the internet for 25 minutes, whatever comes first is going to be your X. And you can also look at it like if it's a cost has to be a Y. So this to surf the internet for 25 minutes at an internet cafe, it costs $7.25. For 40 minutes, so there's another set of minutes, so that's going to be related to the first, but a second X. It costs $9.80. That's related to the Y, but it's different, so Y2. We have to find the cost of surfing the web for 1 hour. So before we do anything, we have to, I'm going to go back and actually label some things because we still need to know what would our M be and what would our B represent. So I'm going to write that off to the side. For Y, we know that represents total costs. Usually that's the same. Our M, because we're relating minutes and costs together, and when we do our slope, actually, let's come back to that and then I'll answer that one. X, we know, has been number of minutes. B is usually going to be like some entrance fee, or the price to start surfing the web or something like that. We can kind of make that up even though it doesn't say that. So first, let's find our slope. So we have y2, so let me write that just in case we've forgotten, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So this would be 980 minus 725 over 40 minus 25. This would give us 2.55 or 2.55 over 15, which would give us, if we divided, 0.17. That 0.17 would be the cost per minute. So Y represented our total costs, X represented our total minutes. This would represent cost per minute. Okay, so now that we found our slope, we have to go back and find our y-intercept, which doesn't begin to answer the question, but we'll get there. Does not matter which one you choose. I'm going to focus on the first one, the 25 and the 725. If you wanted to, again, write these as ordered pairs, you could, just so it starts to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so we'd have y minus my y1 here was 7.25 equals my slope of 0.17 times x minus my x1 was 25. And then I can start solving. And then add 7.25 to both sides. Okay, so now we know $3 is the entrance fee. Now we need to know what would be the total cost for surfing the web for 1 hour. So we have new information. Let's do this because I don't really have space. We're just going to wipe out this problem for a second. If you are running out of space, use more paper. Okay, so now we're looking for the total cost. So that's going to be our y if we're referring back to our things over here. We know our m is 0.17. Our x is number of minutes, but here we're looking for 1 hour. So how many minutes is in an hour? That would be 60. Oops, 60. And we know our B is now 3. So we would put all those things in and start to multiply and solve. So y equals 1020 plus 3. And then if we add that together, 1320 would be our total cost to surf the web for 1 hour. All right, we're gonna do one more, and then we're just gonna talk about some types, and then we'll be done. Okay, for number 15, the value of a car decreases at a constant rate. After 3 years, the value of the car is 15,000. After 2 more years, the value of the car is 11,000. We have to write and solve a linear equation to find the value of the car after 8 years. Because this is in the section where it's given 2 points, we know that number of years is going to be your x, and the value of the car or total value is going to be your y. It gives us 2 points, so this would be 3 for x1, 15,000 for y1. This would be x2, this would be y2. I want to do this one because there's a lot of things we need to know and understand about this problem. But let me write some of the stuff off to the side. We know y is the car value. We're going to figure out m here in a minute. X we know is the number of years. B, because the value of the car is decreasing, B would be the initial car value or the original car value. Okay. So as we are solving this, we'll go back and talk about M and we'll talk about something else. All right. So here, if you again want to write these as ordered pairs, we have 3 and 15,000. Be careful with the second one because it says after 2 more years. So you wouldn't put 2 because it's 2 more years after 3. So this ordered pair would be 5 and 11. Oops, 11, not 10. So this would give us 11,000 minus 15,000 all over 5 minus 3. And as you start to work this out, we get negative 4,000 over 2, which would be negative 2,000. Remember that this said the value of the car decreases. It has to be a negative. Usually your slope is a positive thing in these real world problems, but in this case, it has to be a negative. Because we were looking at the value over the number of years, your M is going to represent the decreasing value per year since it's negative. So I could write that right next to it as well, but I already wrote it up there. So the negative 2,000 represents it's decreasing $2,000 every year, right? Now that we found our slope, we can go back and find our y-intercept by putting in one of the points. Does not matter which one. I'm going to use my 3 and 15,000 point. So y minus 15,000 equals negative 2,000, x minus 3, and distribute. and then add 15,000 to both sides. So y equals negative 2,000, x plus 21,000. This means the initial or the original value of the car, like when it was purchased off the lot, whatever, was 21,000. Now I'm going to go back to the problem. We have to find the value of the car after 8 years. So remember that y is our car value, so that's what we're looking for. We know our slope. We know x represents the number of years, and we know that is now 8. So then we can solve. This would give us y equals negative 16,000 plus 21,000. So after 8 years, the car would only be worth $5,000. All right, I know that was a lot. I'm not going to go through these problems and actually do them. I just want to talk about the types. So for 17, I'm going to look at the numbers. Buying $48 worth of 2 types. Because it says 2 types automatically, you have to be thinking that there are 2 different variables here. If there are 2 different things, this is going to tell you it's going to be written in the form ax plus by equals c. You would need to be able to figure out what is a, what is x, what is b, what is y, what is c. Notice also the number of numbers given. 48, disregard the 2 types. 48.70 per pound, 1.15 per pound, 25 pounds, and we're looking to find the amount. So when you have at least 4 numbers like that, you're going to be doing the standard form, sorry. You could also have 4 numbers if it's like the last type we talked about or something else. So I'll show you those as well. With 18, we see he's keeping track of his weight over several weeks. We see a 2-week, we see a 194 pound. Notice in the next sentence, the next 2 numbers are related to what it said in the first sentence. 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 194 pounds, 186 pounds. So this would be a case where you have to find your M and find your B. This one is a case where you are given 2 points. And have to find M and B, figure out what those are, label them, and go from there. 19, we know there's a $30 delivery fee. We know the cost of the mulch is some 23 per, and we have to find the cost of having 8 yards. This sounds pretty straightforward. I know I'm saying that, I'm the math teacher, but here we only have 3 numbers. When you only have 3 numbers, these are the more straightforward ones. One of these is going to be your M, the word per. One is going to be your B. One is going to be your X or Y. And since cubic is the second part of M, that's going to be your X, and you're looking for Y. So this one is a straight, you put it in and you find out. So you're given your B and your M here. And then the last one, because it's the only type left, this is going to be one where you're given a point and a slope. So let's see how we could find that out. She plans to add $25 per month. So that per, that's going to tell us that's our M. We know after 8 months, she has this much. If you have anything where a certain amount of whatever is related directly with something else, like 8 months, after 8 months, she has $250. Those two things are connected. One of those things is going to be your X1. One of those things is going to be your Y1. That's going to give you your point. So here you're going to be given your M and a point. And you have to find your y-intercept. Hopefully this has been helpful so that you start to see different points. Use this and your practice to go forth and practice more. Come see me if you need any help.